Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to...
It's Depeche Mode, the podcast. My name is Jon Justice. Thank you so much for checking out the episode. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this on YouTube. Also, if you happen to be listening to the podcast, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And you can email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. So, on this week's episode, so I don't know what it is yet, but Depeche Mode has shown up as a reference in a newly released film in the movie theaters. We also have some information on Andrew Fletcher and what he left behind to his family. And I want to talk a little bit about Songs of Faith and Devotion this week. I had another unique experience, and I've kind of been wiping out off that album. An album that I absolutely love, by the way. I think it's probably a toss-up between Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion, of which albums that I am a bigger fan of. But spending some time with Songs of Faith and Devotion this week got me thinking about something, and I wanted to share it with you on the show. So first off, let's get into what little news. Nothing official from the band as of late. Nothing that I can share on the show, but just Depeche Mode out in the wild in the past week. So as I typically do, I went and did a Depeche Mode search online to see if there was any new information this week, and I came across a rather interesting little tidbit. And perhaps if you've seen the film, you can help to fill in the gap here and the mystery that I've now found out about. So there's a brand new movie out directed by Mel Gibson. It's called Flight Risk. It stars Mark Wahlberg. I may actually end up going and seeing it this weekend. But the plot of the film is a pilot transports an air marshal accompanying a fugitive to trial. As they cross the Alaskan wilderness, tensions soar and trust is tested, as not everyone on board is who they seem. So the Flickering Myth review says, it's tough to tell if director Mel Gibson is in on the joke with Flight Risk. Coming from a screenplay by Jared Rosenberg, the initial answer to that question would be yes, given the utterly unhinged redneck performance from a balding Mark Wahlberg as a wacky Depeche Mode singing pilot before turning into a sociopathic one once his character's true identity is exposed. So I've done a search online, and I do not know what Depeche Mode song or songs Mark Wahlberg is singing in the film. I always find it interesting when a Depeche Mode reference makes it into a movie. It doesn't happen very often, but hopefully somebody has seen the film, listens to the show, and can let us know what the context is of what I believe is the villain of Flight Risk singing Depeche Mode songs. Like I said, the movie isn't popular enough to, I guess, warrant that type of detail getting out online just yet, but perhaps if you know the answer to it and you've seen the movie, you can drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube. All right, on a more serious note, several different articles came out in the past week, and I was a little hesitant on whether or not I even wanted to bring it up on the show, but there's some relevancy to it, so I figured I'd share. But Andrew Fletcher, of course, left behind his estate to his family. Probate records were looked at by the Mail Online, and he left behind a substantial estate valued at almost $47 million, 46 pounds. This primarily went to his wife, Granny, and their children, Megan and Joe. And listen, this comes as no surprise. We know that Andrew Fletcher was, for the most part, the management portion of the core band in and of itself. And it didn't surprise me at all, one, that he was able to go and take care of his family. Two, that he had the money to take care of his family based off of the success of Depeche Mode. But three, that, he would have made sure that he built up a small fortune to go and give to his family upon his untimely passing. So Andrew Fletcher is truly missed. It's what makes Memento Mori, despite the quality of the album itself, such a special record. It's so incredibly unfortunate that he was unable to hear any of the finished product or the demos, but that album certainly is a tribute to him. So I went to Costco on Friday. This is how I'm going to start. And I've been on a Songs of Faith and Devotion kick as of late. I actually went and grabbed the remastered CD, and for the first time since the release of Memento Mori, I put it and was listening to it in my car as of late. The only criticism that I have as I get into this of Songs of Faith and Devotion is the production quality of the album, not in terms of the instrumentation, but in the way that it was produced. You try to crank, and maybe it's the quality of stereo that I listen to. And this will be relevant when I get into why I'm bringing up Songs of Faith and Devotion. Because when it comes to an album like Violator, I mean, I can crank that on almost any stereo. Crisp, it's sharp, it's clean. The production on it is fantastic. Now, obviously, the instrumentation and the direction the band went in was dramatic when it came to Songs of Faith and Devotion. So much so that on the production level of that album, you crank it up and the music just it ends up becoming a bit of a wall of sound, which always bums me out a bit. Certain tracks more so than others. I Feel You, Walking in My Shoes. You get a little bit more of a crisp production, even though it's all the same on a track like In Your Room, but I think that is more to do with the instrumentation of it. But I go to Costco on Friday, and I'm driving back, and I've been listening to the album. And Higher Love comes on. And I love every track off of Songs of Faith and Devotion. Higher Love's never been one that lands on any of my playlists, specifically of tracks from Songs of Faith and Devotion. Get Right With Me, I know it's not a major fan favorite. That one usually ends up on a lot of playlists. Certainly In Your Room, Walking in My Shoes, I Feel You to a lesser extent. But also Rush as well. Rush is another one that I revisited that I need to listen to more often. But suddenly Higher Love really grabbed me. And I was listening to it almost like I was listening to it with fresh ears. The pacing of that track, the instrumentation, how cinematic it is certainly a tribute to Alan Wilder and his production value. I mean, after Songs of Faith and Devotion, and I understand the complaint, even though I'm not an individual who thinks that the quality of Depeche Mode music went down considerably when Alan left. I don't believe that. It's just the band moved on and continued making music, and some of it is as good, if not on occasion better than what came before it. But the cinematic nature and certainly what Alan Wilder did with the production of Songs of Faith and Devotion can't be denied. So I'm listening to Higher Love. I'm adding it to playlists now, and it's kind of reached this status of a track that I'll probably end up revisiting like I do In Your Room, even though for now decades since this album has come out, Higher Love was a track that I never gave a second thought to. But as I've been listening over the course of the past week to the album itself, it got me wondering, why was that album so successful? It was such a dramatic departure from Violator. I remember getting the CD single for I Feel You, and I believe I first heard the track before I got the CD single on K-Rock, and I was really K-Rock Radio in Los Angeles. And I recall being really taken aback by how abrupt it was. I think the expectation that I had was it was going to be a Violator 2.0. Violator wasn't that far removed from music for the masses or what came before it. Every album has been different. There's been a change in direction. There's no denying that. But the crispness of the electronic sort of standard that they'd set moving forward got upended with Songs of Faith and Devotion. You're coming off of Violator, this massive album. You think they're reaching their apex mountain, and yet Songs of Faith and Devotion takes it to another level, and certainly the tour does as well. And yet the album in and of itself, apart from the guitar work, which is on Violator, but handled in a much more subtle way where it's in the mix and it's not as prominent, Songs of Faith and Devotion comes off as a rock album where Violator still comes off as very much a synth-based electronic album. And listening to the album this week, and I absolutely love it, I'm suddenly struck by how much of a departure it was from Violator. I dare say now that if circumstances were presented similarly and the band were to put out 2 albums like that in the more modern era, if it would have been received nearly as well. And I could be wrong on this. It just surprised me. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the album is very good, make no mistake. And I've mentioned on the show that in years past, I've heard criticism of Songs of Faith and Devotion. So what I'm speaking to is more pointed to those individuals who did not like Songs of Faith and Devotion because it wasn't like Violator, and it was too far off of what they've been used to for Depeche Mode. But the fact that that wasn't the majority opinion of the album, I find really, really surprising. And perhaps it speaks to the quality of the album in and of itself. These are fantastic songs, even if the musical arrangements are really big departures from what we'd seen before previously, just a few years that preceded it with Violator. But I also remember being a fan in that era, in that time period, in my 20s, and how the majority of fans that were following Depeche Mode, reaching a fever pitch in our fandom, clamoring for new music, I think there was a willingness, my opinion is there was a willingness to get to know this album, to get used to this music, even if, like me, when I first heard I Feel You, I wasn't quite sure if I liked it. Sure, if you asked me at the time because I was such a diehard fan and would be more of an apologist about it, I would say, no, it's great. But I'll tell you, it was challenging in the beginning, and I grew to love that album. I grew to love I Feel You. I had a similar experience with Barrel of a Gun as well. That song was a little bit, you had to kind of approach with caution. I just thought it was really interesting because those albums are so drastically different. And yet, it was just a massive, massive success. Now, we also didn't have, the internet, and we didn't have the ability to get lost in sort of opinion bubbles and have, viewpoints cemented because somebody feels a certain way and then they end up finding a thread in a group of people that feel the same way and then you get stuck in groupthink. We happen just to be talking amongst our friends, if our friends were even Depeche Mode fans, and so we were probably better positioned to form opinions over a period of time rather than be influenced by other people's opinions. None of this is a criticism. It's just an observation that Songs of Faith and Devotion was really a massive dramatic departure in a very short period of time from what the band had done before. I mean, so much so that you can't really compare that album to any other album. Like, there are moments when I listen to Memento Mori and I'm kind of go, Don't Say You Love Me is, kind of a kindred spirit to In Your Room, but then it's really not. Ghosts Again is certainly in the same sort of ballpark as Enjoy the Silence, but Songs of Faith and Devotion really is a standout in terms of its production, the quality of the songwriting as well. They leaned back into it a little bit with Playing the Angel, and maybe a little bit with Delta Machine with the blues aspect, but I'm always hesitant to look at Songs of Faith and Devotion and to say that it's got a blues influence to it. I know it's there, but I never listen to it with those types of ears. I just think it's a really good cinematic depth. It's got a lot of depth to it. It reminds me a little bit, and I'll leave it on this as I'm kind of just getting lost in my own thoughts. I just thought it was interesting. That album is such a departure, and yet it was so massively successful. But, it's kind of like comparing Star Wars A New Hope to The Empire Strikes Back. Like, A New Hope was great when I was a kid. So much fun, so exciting. And then you get to The Empire Strikes Back, and you almost, again, you have to approach it with caution. It's a much different film. Kind of goes out on a, on a cliffhanger ending. It's a lot darker than the one that came before it, and yet it's hugely successful. I love those types of mirrors in life and those types of parallels. So, listen, as always, this is more stream of consciousness and the lack of finding out when we're going to get the live release for Memento Mori, if the Mexican documentary will be re-released sometime soon, or we'll get those 4 unreleased tracks. So, feel free to share your thoughts. TalkShowNerd. I trepidatiously give you the email address, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube. All right, let's go to your emails. First off, greetings, John, from Chile, Worcestershire. I always get this wrong. I'm not even going to try. Hope all is well with you. Haven't been in touch for a while, but rest assured I've still been tuning in every week and enjoying the show. I may be in a minority, however. I very much enjoyed the Martin interview with Dave Huxtable about languages. German was my major at university, so an interview with Martin about his love of languages as a youngster was right up my street. I, too, went to Germany on school exchanges and was probably the only one who bothered to try to speak German whilst there. Linking this back to your previous show, the interview was also timely as it aligned with what I would ask Martin if we ever found ourselves discussing the world we live in and life in general. People have spoken previously about Berlin's influence on Martin, and by extension, the musical and lyrical direction of the band. What I'd love to explore is how much Martin's decision to move to Berlin bolstered by a confidence from having learned German at school. For example, would he have still moved there full time, lived the Berlin scene, and been exposed to as many German electronic bands without having learned German previously? DM may have still recorded at Hansa Studios like their idols before them. And given it was cheap, being right by the wall, however, would their Berlin trilogy have ended up sounding like a very different band? Less leather, sex, and samples, perhaps. P.S. If you or any of your friends of the show ever get to Berlin, I heartily recommend the Depeche Mode tour of Hansa Studio. Our guide, Thilo, who organizes the tours, was amazing, and I still get goosebumps thinking about standing in the control room with the intros to Black Celebration and Stripped pumping out the speakers. Best wishes from the UK. Thank you so much for the email. It's great to hear from you. All right, Gary writes, a longtime listener, really enjoyed your podcasts, especially the ones about my favorite band, Depeche Mode. I managed to snag a ticket for Nine Inch Nails and their Manchester show coming up in the summer of 2025 for their tour in Europe, which got me thinking about the crossover influence between both bands. I remember reading an article where Trent Reznor mentioned that Black Celebration was particularly influential for him, especially after seeing them on tour. I've never heard Depeche Mode explicitly mention Nine Inch Nails, but I do think Playing the Angel has a very Nine Inch Nails vibe in its final production. The opening sirens of A Pain That I'm Used To, the crunchy beats at the end of Macro, for example, really stand out. I wonder if Hillier or the band pushed that heavier industrial sound direction. I thought it would make for an interesting podcast episode exploring how these two bands might have influenced each other over the years. Thanks for the great content, and I love hearing your thoughts, Gary. You know, it's interesting. I think that, when we talk about bands being influenced by one another, I guess I kind of wonder, what does that influence mean? Certainly, both of these bands, Nine Inch Nails and Depeche Mode, being electronic-based, and the lyrical content, where Nine Inch Nails is certainly a much more aggressive, harder edge. When you look at the lyrical content of Martin Gore during that time period, and during sort of the apex of Nine Inch Nails, Pretty Hate Machine, the Downward Spiral era, Nine Inch Nails was the closest band that I could get to my beloved Depeche Mode. I mean, to the point that back in those years, during Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith and Devotion, again, when Pretty Hate Machine and the Downward Spiral were out and Nine Inch Nails was touring, I would have told you that Nine Inch Nails was my favorite band. What's funny is that I've treated Nine Inch Nails much in the same way past Depeche Mode fans have treated Depeche Mode. I kind of lost interest in the band as the years went on, mostly because of the relatability factor. I'll still go back and revisit Nine Inch Nails, the Broken EP as well. I mean, we'll talk about being hard-edged. Because Nine Inch Nails was the closest sort of, comparison I could have to a band that was like Depeche Mode but wasn't Depeche Mode. But I just ended up losing interest in the band after, a few albums after that and haven't really followed them since. I've considered getting tickets for their most recent tour, so I'll end up being that fan that was a huge fan for them back when they were immensely popular but hasn't revisited anything in years. I doubt that there was much influence that Nine Inch Nails had on Depeche Mode, but I don't have much of a doubt that Depeche Mode, in terms of being synth-based and electronic-based, had an influence on Trent Reznor. If just from a standpoint of, I like what those guys are doing, I'm going to do my version of it. And as always, I'd love to hear from you, talkshownerd@gmail.com. All right, let's go here, and we will talk with George in Hamburg, Germany, who writes this. Always a pleasure, sometimes a little treasure, listening to your pod. Thank you very much. Keep it up. Some issues bring me back to return to certain tracks and memories I share with them. This time, it was around the 12-inch versions. I got into Depeche Mode in the early 80s in Germany. It was either you like them or you don't, as far as I can remember. I simply loved them, he writes. And in a lot of occasions, I had to defend myself for listening to DM or the boys because they were a full-on electronic band. I lived in a small village where people were not as open, probably. Anyways, that's a different story. Back in the 80s, one of my favorite 12-inch versions was the Slavery Whip mix of Master and Servant. Maybe one reason being was the Marvel-colored vinyl it was pressed on. Almost every 12-inch of DM was on colored vinyl back then, at least in Germany. I still think the mix is great, and your request brought me back to listen to it. So I put on my old vinyl from back then, and in this occasion, some others too. So I quickly set up my top 20 favorite remix versions, as there are so many. Of the tracks, there are really 2 or 3 mixes I love: Walking in My Shoes, Enjoy the Silence, etc. But I did try to pick my favorite, which might differ from time to time and mood. And he ended up attaching his best of list, which was lengthy, and I don't have it in my notes here, so I apologize. But George, thank you so much for the email. I greatly appreciate it. All right, let's go to Jean, who writes this. I know it's not a regular remix, but I love what Alan did with I Want You Now on the Exotic Tour. For me, it's by far the best DM remix. I totally agree. In this version, clearly has a post-Bloodline Recoil vibe, which I personally don't like, but it works here. And he shared with me a SoundCloud link. Also, I believe for many of us, the album version of I Want You Now is obviously the sexiest DM song from many points of view, followed by In Your Room. Cheers, Jean, or Jan, I believe it's Jean. Thank you for that. Yeah, I got to thinking more about it, and I Want You Now did not, that completely slipped my mind when I was talking about the sexiest DM songs. Ghost is very direct, right? I mean, so is I Want You Now, but it, at least it has a little bit of subtlety to it. By the way, side note, talking about songs of faith and devotion. So I was mentioning that I was listening to the disc from the remastered versions that came with the DVD. This is the first time that I realized that in the artwork, they actually included Death's Door in the same font as the rest of the tracks that Anton Corbijn had written for the artwork on the album. I had never noticed that they included Death's Door before. Learn something new every day, even when I'm doing my own podcast. All right, let's go to, Zach writes this. I also really loved hearing Martin discuss his childhood and other interests. I'm a longtime fan and couldn't care in the least that he didn't discuss or was asked about Depeche Mode. It's also not surprising to me that Lynch was a DM fan. There's a lot of thematic symmetry between the two artists, both musically and visually. The video for Dream On was inspired by Lost Highway, their love of both blues and industrial music, Martin's obvious love for Julie Cruz, and the Baldamente as evidence via the covers for songs like Breathe, Death's Door, Blue Dress, etc. Finally, I never thought even their accessible songs were traditional pop, so I totally see the symmetry between DM's more mainstream work and their influence. DM music, like the Banshees and the Bunnymen and the Cure, is a perfect marriage of the accessible and the avant-garde. That's a really good observation. Thank you for that. And lastly, David Hudson writes, the interview with Martin was really humanizing. It's nice to see him for the first time in a normal conversation just as a guy. It's a really good point. I enjoyed the interview as well. Again, I just thought it was funny that this guy has all this extended time to talk with Martin, and they never discussed Depeche Mode. I look forward to hearing from you between now and next week. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. If you like to read science fiction, I've written a science fiction space opera adventure series. It's called EMBARK. It's got a lot of Depeche Mode references, direct and indirect, while telling an exciting science fiction saga. 7 books in all in the series. The audiobooks were narrated and produced by me, and you can pick up the series in ebook, Kindle Unlimited, paperback, and hardcover at Amazon.com. Just search for EMBARK and Jon Justice. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. I'll talk to you next week, and I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. Bye.
Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
Depeche Mode, the podcast.